Hi, I hope you can all hear me. So I hope you're all having a great day. I have the pleasure of introducing our next festival speaker, Dr. Katherine Trebeck from the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. So this provocation is going to ask, is the Wellbeing Economy agenda the right idea at the right time? So thank you very much.
Oh, great. Thank you, Holly. Put myself on. There we go. Just pulling up my slides. And hopefully you can all see that. Holly, can you give me a shout if that's all working? Is that all good? Holly, can you tell me if that's visible now? Okay, I'm just going to plow on. So hoping it's all okay. So really excited to be here. Sorry? Say again?
It's perfect. Thank you. That's great.
Okay, thanks, Holly. Thanks ever so much. Just need the little thumbs up that it's happening. So thanks ever so much for the PEP team and particularly for Holly for hosting me. And it's really great to be here. We're really proud that PEP are members of WEAll and have been really excited by the program for this festival that's been pulled together, and really honoured to have a little slot of it in it and be part of your conversations. As Holly said, I work for the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, and I've been probably for more years than I care to imagine or think about, I've been working on how do we transform the economic system. And what I want to talk today about is this idea of the wellbeing economy that's bubbling up in political conversations. We're hearing a lot of politicians and policy briefings start to reference the idea of the wellbeing economy. And I want to share with you some of the origins of that story, of what it's about, and some of the contours of what the ambition is, and just think about how we can go about enacting a wellbeing economy, because it's sorely needed. So I want to just start by reflecting on the moment of change that we find ourselves in. And I have to confess that I thought at the beginning of the year, watching my home country of Australia burning, that this would be the wake-up call to policymakers, particularly in Australia. I thought scenes like this is a photo taken at lunchtime on a beach in the south of Victoria, southeast of Australia, where the whole town of Malakuta had been evacuated onto the beach because the bushfires were racing towards them. And you can just see how dark and eerie the sky is because of the smoke and the flames coming towards them. And the town ended up being rescued by the Australian Navy. I mean, these are horror story images. And to me, the fact and the extent to which Australia was on fire at the beginning of the year, I thought, surely we cannot go back to those old recipes. I dared to hope that policy leaders who in the past had been recalcitrant and just reaching for old recipes of grow the economy faster and faster and don't worry about the damage that does to people and planet, I thought that this would be the wake-up call. I thought there would be unusual coalitions coming together because of the diversity of people who are impacted by this. And of course I was wrong. And then we have this global experience of the COVID-19 crisis. And I just this afternoon walked past a beer garden where they've got, like they have in this photo of the gym here, plastic sheets around every single one of the tables. And so what COVID has revealed is we are able as a society to undertake massive change dramatically. And I think now we're at almost a precipice where there's this window of opportunity to bring in the sort of enormous changes in our policy and our economic systems that we require to create a more healthy, more sustainable, more equal economy. And yet I'm quite nervous still, because I have been just recently dramatically wrong in my hope for change. And I think the fight is on now, because I think the voices of those old recipes are ringing in policymakers' ears very loudly. And we can perhaps talk about that in the question and answer discussion later, how we can mobilise collectively to try and hold the agenda and hold the ambition as high as it needs to be. But I wanted to reflect on why at the Wellbeing Economy Alliance and why throughout much of my working life I've been looking at the nature of the economic system. And WEAll was created because a whole lot of organisations came together, each in their own different way, had been working on economic system change because they realised that of all the challenges facing the world, we won't have a chance at attending to them and creating a better future if we don't attend to how the economic system is set up. And I just want to reflect on some of the contours of the reality of the economic system. So in countries like the UK, we've entered a terrain where economists amongst you will recognise this term of diminishing marginal returns. Essentially, the job of economic growth has been done. We are one of the richest countries in the world. There has been undeniable social progress in terms of life expectancy rising, in terms of diseases being eradicated, in terms of shelter being provided. But the returns in the UK and globally, you can look at this and look at research, for example, the Genuine Progress Indicator or the Social Progress Index. You can see that early stages of economic development, more GDP growth really matters, but those returns start to tail off. So you sort of get that shape in the charts. And that is where we are in the UK. The job of growth has been done. And in fact, what we're doing now is we're in a situation where we're spending so much of our collective money putting sticking plasters on the damage that pursuing more and more economic growth is doing to communities and to the planet. And so this image here of the security guards, it's been estimated that in the US, over 5 million people work in what's been described as guard labour, so security guards or police or in the defence forces, essentially employed because we as a society are scared of each other. But once we start thinking about failure demand, you'll see it everywhere. It's a bit like an onion, all these layers of social policy, apparent successes, where in fact they are nothing better than sticking plasters on an inhumane economic system, helping people survive and cope with a toxic, unequal economic system that we have in places like the UK. And so it's things like top up wages because people's income is not providing them enough to put food on the table for their families. It's housing benefit. In environmental terms, environmental economists will talk about defensive expenditure, and you think about all the layers of spending that we have to build back after a bushfire or after some of the floods that we've had in Yorkshire at the beginning of the year. There are just so many layers to this. Redistribution. I mean, we've been accustomed and attuned and trained to think of and celebrate when we redistribute the gap between rich and poor, and no longer do we stop and ask, why did we allow the gap to open up so widely in the first place? So diminishing marginal returns and failure demands are some of the key concepts, just really building the argument around the inadequacy of our economic system. And the other one I want to talk about, and I set these out in a book I wrote with Jeremy Williams that was published early last year, called The Economics of Arrival. And the other concept that Jeremy and I use comes from the brilliant Chilean economist Manfred Max Neef, who died last summer, unfortunately. But he talks about this idea of pseudo-satisfiers. And he reminds us that as humans, wherever we are in the world, we have innate, common, universal human needs. But because of our diversity in cultures and location and so on, we have different ways of satisfying them. And Max Neef warns us against pseudo-satisfiers, that so much we are reaching for flawed solutions to try and satisfy our fundamental human needs. And you can think of the very natural human need for belonging and social affiliation. And so often we are told and dictated to almost by advertisers that if we just buy another can of Coke or get the right sunglasses, that will meet our fundamental human needs. We reach for consumption and consumerism to actually try and feel a deep human need for belonging and being part of a community. But, you know, the concept we can also apply at the macroeconomy level, where the I'd say quite appropriate searching for quality of life, financial security, decent housing, good relationships, sense of security, sense of purpose, dignity, a decent natural environment. And what we've been doing collectively as society and as policymakers, we've been reaching for the pseudo-satisfier of GDP growth. And the problem is that the connection between GDP growth and those higher order goals is wearing very, very thin. And worse than that, the more we start to keep on pursuing it and trying to squeeze every last ounce of GDP growth out of the economy, the more damage we will do to people and planet. And so the opportunity is really to recognise this possibility of arrival, that GDP-rich countries like the UK have got enough wealth and resources. We are just pretty terrible at sharing and cherishing them. And so if we recognise that we've got enough, that begs a different conversation. And it's what Jeremy and I describe as, we now need to make ourselves at home. And that's a very different sort of economy. That's about what we now describe as a wellbeing economy. It's an economy that attends to distribution, to social justice, to protecting the planet. So I want to share with you a little bit about what the wellbeing economy is. And at WEAll, we asked our members, our amazing members, about what they thought the economy needed to deliver. And of course, all our members have their own constituencies, their own communities. So this is a lovely mini crowdsourcing, if you like, of some needs that a wellbeing economy needs to deliver. And I imagine these will be quite intuitive to you. So it's about connection, delivering that self of belonging and reorientating our institutions so that they serve the common good. It's about participation, ensuring that people feel active in the decisions that impact them, and having locally rooted economies that are generating economic activity from the bottom up rather than waiting for the crumbs to fall from the table. A wellbeing economy, of course, is about nature. It's about restoring and regenerating the natural world for its own purpose, not seeing it as an input into the economic production process. A wellbeing economy is about fairness in all its dimensions, horizontal and vertical inequalities, massively reducing that pernicious toxic gap between the richest and the poorest. And a wellbeing economy has to be about ensuring dignity for everyone, ensuring that everyone has enough. And so you put those together and we have the core elements of a wellbeing economy. The challenge is that our current economic system, the one we had prior to COVID, and the one I'm so anxious about that we might just try to resuscitate beyond COVID, is so misaligned to delivering these sorts of core needs. And so how can we transform the economic system, build a wellbeing economy that has at its very purpose delivering on those needs? Now, I want to share with you, this is a really arbitrary list of moments in time that I think I use to just really remind us that we are part of a journey here, and this conversation has been building momentum over many decades. And so this is completely arbitrary, but it'll give you a sense that this conversation and the ones you're part of during the festival is really standing on the shoulders of some amazing people and activists and organizations that have gone before. And so we could track it back even prior to this, but one of the key moments, of course, is the 1968 speech by Robert Kennedy when he was in the campaign to become president. And unfortunately, he was assassinated just a few months after this speech. But if you haven't taken the time to listen to this speech on YouTube, grab it, play it, turn the volume up, because it is one of the most poetic tirades against the measure of progress of GDP that you're ever likely to hear. It's extraordinarily timely today. But it reminds us that decades ago, already political leaders were recognising that we shouldn't hitch our wagons too much to gross domestic product. Just a couple of years later, the Club of Rome published through their work at MIT, the Limits to Growth report, which became a best-selling book, and all the analysis that's been done since has shown that their predictions have been borne out, that we're entering this stage of limits to growth, and they point the finger very firmly at economic growth as the cause of humanity breaching up against its limits. That same year, though, the King of Bhutan, that tiny little kingdom stuck between China and India, declared that gross national happiness was more important than GDP. And they're now measuring themselves as a country by 9 domains of gross national happiness. Now, race forward a couple of decades. We, of course, over 10 years ago had the global financial crisis. And that was a moment of change that many people working on economic system change dared to hope that we wouldn't return to business as usual after the global financial crisis. People dared to hope that this would be the moment of crisis where we reach for new recipes. And again, of course, just as I was after the Australian bushfires, we were wrong. What happened is policymakers pushed down on the accelerator of GDP more, and they brought in this program of austerity in countries like the UK, in the desperate need to try to get back to GDP growth. So we missed that opportunity. But just that following year, there was a report commissioned for President Sarkozy of France at the time, where he asked these world-leading Nobel Prize-winning economists to look at what are the measures of progress of society. And this was one of the most catalytic reports that really galvanized the Beyond GDP movement. A couple of years later, the UN, led by Bhutan and Costa Rica, issued a high-level report on a new development paradigm. This was collecting, all sorts of governments signed up to this, really recognizing we needed a new paradigm of economic development if we're going to have a chance of protecting the environment and attending to the social injustices that are blighting our world. It didn't seem to go anywhere. But then, of course, a few years later, the UN brought down the Sustainable Development Goals. A couple of years later, there was a refresh, an updated report of that 2009 one, the one for Sarkozy. And this again was Joseph Stiglitz writing this time for the OECD. And they cautioned very strongly, and they looked back over the last few years prior to that report and said that too much focus amongst policymakers had been on getting the economy growing faster, and that brought in the financial insecurity because of austerity that has led to some of the political ructions that we see the fallout of still today. That same year, WEAll and WEGO, which I'll tell you about later, the Wellbeing Economy Governments partnership, was launched. Again, that same year, of course, was when school students started coming out of their classrooms and saying to their political leaders, enough of this recalcitrance. The following year, last year, one of the key moments I think that happened is we had a collection of academics writing to the European Union and saying enough of GDP, we need to focus on well-being. And that Growth and Stability Pact, that is essentially the governing document of the European Union, they said needs to be replaced by a Sustainability and Wellbeing Pact. That same year, very famously, New Zealand, under the Prime Ministership of Jacinda Ardern, launched apparently, and I think it's a bit unfair to Bhutan, but launched what's been called the world's first wellbeing budget. And then towards the end of the year, we had Finland in the driving seat in the European Union with their presidency, and they brought about something called the economy of wellbeing. I've got a little smiley face there because I'm a little bit dubious about the merits of it, but we can talk about that later. And then, of course, COVID hit. And I just sort of wanted to sort of share with you, there's this momentum that's been growing that has its roots over many, many decades. But essentially, if we're going to build on that momentum and create a wellbeing economy, it's about saying we are no longer content to help people survive and cope within an inhumane economic system. All that spending on failure demand, all that effort for redistribution is no longer good enough. Important though that it is, because it's essentially a humanitarian response, but we cannot stay in that space. We need to raise our gaze and think about how can we get the economy to do more of the heavy lifting? How can we move from the middle panel in this cartoon, which is essentially, I'd say, the social democratic consensus of the last few decades, which has been sort of humanize the current system and extract what you can out of the growth economy to do so, to actually fundamental transformation of our economy so it delivers first time around. And that requires changes at all levels of our system, from the measures of progress to the policies that we have and individual practices. But one of the key, I guess, levers of change is how do we define what the purpose of our economy is about, which is why I keep banging on about how we need to ditch GDP, because if we get that right, a whole lot of policy changes and practice changes will be much easier. And essentially, if we can do that, we can ask much more of the economy, ask the economy to do more of the heavy lifting. And the sorts of changes I'd say would be important for that is this idea of pre-distribution. To me, this is one of the most exciting agendas. This is essentially how do we design market outcomes through things like cooperatives, more community ownership, community wealth building, in a way to design the outcomes of the market activity are more equal in the first place, rather than letting huge inequalities open up and then turning to the government and say we need all this help through taxes and welfare to redistribute. Foundational economy, and I've already said community wealth building, are really important about building the economy from the bottom up. And in environmental sense of the term, really starting to take into account so many of the damage that's done to the environment that so often we've pushed aside and dismissed as an externality. We need to bring that into the purview of producers and consumers in terms of how we shift the economy. So on our website, we have a live matrix called The Old Way, the New and to the New Way. And it's essentially an at-a-glance sense of how different a wellbeing economy might be from the one of today. And it goes through a whole wide range of different subject areas. And as I say, it's live, so you're welcome to go in and suggest things we've missed and add some detail, and we'll update it regularly so it benefits from the movements inside. But I want to pull out a couple of examples. So one is around housing. At the moment, so much of our housing stock in places like the UK is hugely energy efficient, partly because it's uninsulated. It's so often rationed by price, so as opposed to by needs. And perhaps most perniciously, it's used as an investment device by rentiers, people who are going to just sit back and let the capital gains drive their wealth stock. And that's one of the key drivers of our growing economic inequality in the UK. And instead, in a wellbeing economy, we can imagine much more sustainable design for our housing stock. We can imagine co-housing, where you have, for example, like the amazing example of Lilac in the town of Leeds, where you have 25 families living together and sharing, say, 4 washing machines. So they're not using as much energy and resources, but they're sharing through co-housing. Loads of brilliant examples around that. And of course, more publicly and community-owned housing, rather than allowing it to be rationed by price and dominated by people who just want to make money out of our homes. Another example is around work and in-work poverty. At the moment, we've got a huge amount of failure demand spending on tax credits, huge gaps between highest and lowest paid, ferocious specialisation and automation, where workers are being treated like just-in-time inventory, literally on demand at the click of an app, and the cost that employers say they need to reduce. And in a wellbeing economy, we could see people being treated as human beings rather than a cost to be reduced. With redesigned jobs, tasks would be shared, autonomy would be devolved. You get much more purpose and sense of meaning from your work when you have the chance to follow through a task. We'd share work more evenly throughout us, so maybe shorter working weeks, so that we don't have huge inequalities of overwork and then underwork, people not getting enough hours to make enough money to put food on the table. And going back to that idea of pre-distribution, we'd have workers owning a share of their business so that they are the ones that capture the value that they create. And we'd have a much better alignment between wages and the social value. That's something that's really come to the fore, I think, during the COVID crisis. And in terms of mindsets, we have so often been told that there is no alternative to business as usual. This is inevitable. I've even heard a policy advisor, a senior in one of the governments that we speak to, saying, well, the economy is just like gravity in the weather. There's nothing we can do about it. And that's a dangerous mindset because it takes away our hope. Well, in a wellbeing economy, we will recognise that already there are thousands of alternatives out there. We just need to breathe life into them and roll them out and inspire others to replicate them, because it is literally in our power to design the economy differently. And what we would have is our mindset, if we're thinking about a wellbeing economy, would be putting the economy in its place as in service of those higher order goals of the environment and social justice. I'm going to race through these just because in the interest of time, I want to really get to discussion later. Just by way of finishing, WEAll is a little project that we've been part of instigating, and it's a group of governments led by Scotland, New Zealand, Iceland and Wales, who are now collaborating to put wellbeing at the heart of economic policy making. And I think it's a really exciting, nascent example of the sort of different ways of doing policy making and even doing international relations and international diplomacy that we need more of if we're going to get to a wellbeing economy. I want to just say, by way of finishing, a few remarks about WEAll. Essentially, our job is to amplify those who are rolling up their sleeves and putting this into practice. The amazing pioneers around the world, groups like PEP, our colleagues across the world who are finding ways to create a wellbeing economy where they are. We want to shine a light on them. We want to tell policymakers about them. We want to help them connect and scale up their impact so that they can feel that they're part of a movement, feel that people have their back, and feel that they become more impactful by working together. Essentially, those of you who are political scientists will probably know the term the Overton window, but this is a cartoon version of that. It's essentially about moving the conversation away from seeing there is no alternative to actually embracing the fact that this is possible to create a different economic system. But in a nutshell, this is our theory of change. WEAll is really a membership-led organisation that recognises that if we work together, if we team up, if we collaborate, we can achieve extraordinary change. And you're all really, really welcome to be part of that. So look forward to chatting with you. Oh, and this is, we have a lot of fun while we're doing it. Henry is somewhere in that photo. There he is on the left. So this is WEAll having a lot of fun together while we're changing the world. Thanks ever so much, Holly.
Thank you so much for that, Katherine. That was a really insightful provocation. And, you know, our festival centered all around new thinking and change, and the Wellbeing Economy agenda kind of epitomizes just that, and also gives a great hope for the world, for the future, about how you can actually organize change. So thank you so much. If you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box, and don't forget to vote. We'll move on to that. I'd just like to ask one first, because as an economics student and also a social policy student, but generally a student who would love to progress in a career that promotes change, where we can change our economic system, I'd like to know kind of more about your professional journey into your career, everything you've done so far. If you would mind sharing that, I'd find that really enlightening.
Sure. So I started life as a political economist. I did my PhD in politics, and I was looking then at massive mining companies in Australia and how they were shaped by Aboriginal communities around their mine sites who were demanding that they change their behaviour. And I think that was a real insight into just the enormity of corporate power, but also the potential of communities working together and striking alliances, because you had Aboriginal communities working with unions and anti-nuclear activists and environmentalists, and they were able to get this massive, massive company that I was looking at to change their ways. And it was quite extraordinary to see different sorts of power being exercised. And so I've sort of held those ideas for me ever since. And so I guess one of the messages there is, if you have an opportunity to dive deep through, say, PhD or master's to a subject area that you're fascinated by, that you would happily spend 3 years of your life working on, then absolutely take that, because I still think that was the most self-indulgent 3 years of my life, and just such a fascinating period of time. But after that, I moved to Scotland, and Holly, I'm afraid it wasn't out for any professional reason. It was no career-orientated decision. It was because I'd fallen in love with Scotland as a country. Something had sort of got me here about this amazing country where I now live. But I was lucky. I got a job at the University of Glasgow, and it was looking at, again, sort of corporate behaviours, and I sort of created this research project with my supervisors. So I was, again, out looking at corporate behaviours and how they impacted communities, but it was also a big chance to look around the terrain in the UK and get up to speed about what was happening here. But at the time, this was the era of no impact agenda in academia, no open access agenda, and I just felt a discomfort by doing all this work with communities and then having the results behind paywalls and obtuse academic language. And I wanted to feel a bit closer to impact and to making a bit of a change. And maybe that was a bit of a sort of idealistic or self-indulgent idea, but I wanted to move outside academia. And so eventually I got a job with Oxfam. I've done several different roles with Oxfam, and partly facing the UK, partly particularly facing Scotland, and then in a global role working with someone you all know, Kate Rayworth, around sort of downscaling the donuts for different countries. And what I became challenging with that work is that I really thought, if we are serious about economic development globally, we need to focus on the rich world economic models. And I was saying this in corridors in Oxfam, and I didn't feel I was getting as far as I needed to. And so when I was asked by Stuart Wallace, who's the chair of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, would I be interested in helping start it up, I thought, yeah, this is a project I want to move on. But it's always been a case of going where my interest is. I've never had any sense of I want to be at the top of the organisation or climb the greasy pole, or I wanted to really go where I felt there was that combination of really interesting work, working with people I was proud of. I think that is probably one of the biggest privileges in a job. If you're proud of your team, that's an amazing fortune. But also do work that I felt was making a difference. And for me, that wasn't, I guess, grassroots work. It wasn't sort of frontline work. And I think folks who do that work are absolute heroes. My husband's an emergency services first responder and the fireman, and I think that works amazing. But for me, it was looking at the economic system and how we can change that. And now it's, I mean, how lucky to work for an organisation. And so for everyone who's interested in getting involved in WEAll, we've got something called WEAll Citizens, where anyone can join up and be part of that community and learn from and exchange with people the other side of the world about what they're doing and connect with each other. So everyone's really welcome to join WEAll Citizens.
That's a really heartening journey of finding your focus and not necessarily having knowing exactly what you want to do, but finding as you go along the way what seems right. Thank you very much for sharing that.
So there's a beautiful Scottish phrase that I can't say the Gaelic, but the translation is, "Your feet will bring you to where your heart is." And to me, that's just such a, if you're lucky enough, and I would recognise that this is such a global privilege to have choices and do work that's aligned with your passion, but to be able to follow where your heart's going and land in work that's fascinating. So listen to that and don't be sort of blinkered by these agendas of making loads of money and all those sorts of things, because I think there's so much more to life than that.
I think that's probably the best career advice you could probably get, and also a beautiful phrase to keep with you. I hope that people do remember that. But thank you. So we'll move on to some questions from the participants. So at the moment, the top voted question is from Adam, and he's asking, what would you say to people who think that saying we're a rich country is a metropolitan liberal thing to say because they're still really struggling to survive in our rich countries?
Yeah, absolutely. So the idea of arrival is a sort of it's a macro description for a country like the UK that in aggregate has got a ton of resources, and you can see how much we've wasted over the last few years with frivolous spending that's unnecessary because of failure demand and all those things that I talked about. But hence the second part of the conversation, and that's to make ourselves at home. So arrival and recognising we're rich in aggregate in terms of wealth and resources doesn't by any means mean that things are sorted and that everything is great and fantastic. Actually, perhaps even the harder conversation is, how do we make ourselves at home? How do we share those wealth and resources? How do we ensure that everyone has enough? Because there's plenty in this country. We are just so hopeless. And it's worse than hopeless. We've got structures that prevent us from sharing those wealth and resources. There's something sort of deliberate and political about the maldistribution of the resources. So I'd entirely agree with where I think that the gist of Adam's question's going, and hence why perhaps the more important second task is to make ourselves at home and attend to those inequalities. And of course, it's recognising that there are plenty of places, just down the road from me here in Glasgow, where they patently don't have enough. But that's not because of a lack in the country, it's because of a lack of sharing.
So we have a lot to learn from the Wellbeing Economy agenda in that respect, definitely. Thank you. Another question from Michael. He's talking about post-COVID regrowth. He's saying, is restoration of business as usual even possible given the devastation of the sectors where people interact? So he's talking about international travel, commuting for no good reason, etc.
Yeah, I think there's a hopeful story to that, Michael, and I think then there's a really toxic, terrifying story, because we won't go back to how things were. That's impossible in many, many senses. The good scenario, a good aspect to that is things like business travel will be much more reduced, and frivolous holidays and so on. And I was speaking to someone from the investment community a few weeks ago, and he was saying that in his line of work, you had to go to a physical meeting to be seen to be attentive to a client. You just had to jump on a plane. You weren't seen as a serious account manager if you didn't do that. And he was saying, well, that won't happen again. He's hoping. But I think there will be we won't ever go back to what we would have recognised before, partly because of those sorts of trends, and the reality of COVID will probably be with us for a long time. I think the other danger is that actually we go back in the push from those who are saying we need the old recipes, we need to grow the economy, that's the right sort of economic model. The risk is that they will sacrifice things like environmental regulation, labour rights, such that they were, and of course they weren't enough, but they will sacrifice those sorts of things in the effort to get faster GDP growth. So that's the scary scenario that we're facing. It's a more toxic form of business as usual.
That's really interesting. Thanks. So we've got another question from Parmjit. How can we get NGOs to understand the fundamental nature of change needed and support it? Great question. I think NGOs are really different. There's the big and the small, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And most of them have amazing people working for them who've gone into that line of work for the right reasons. I think though those NGOs who are focused on humanizing the current system need to be much more honest about what their project is about, and recognize that there's a task for looking upstream a bit, raising their gaze from the humanitarian response, which I would never want to say is unimportant. I'll be devastated if I was ever misconstrued as that. That humanitarian responses, whether it's food banks here in the UK or sort of aid globally, that is so important, but it should be unnecessary. We should be smart enough, in the middle of 2020 to create a world that is much better at sharing, where we don't have people in a country like the UK requiring food parcels. And that is a conversation that's about politics and distribution, not charity. It's about justice rather than charity. And so I think, how to get that conversation happening in NGOs, it is happening in some NGOs, some more than others. But I think those of us who, want to make common cause with the social justice movement and those NGOs who are working this space need to just open up the tables and open up the conversations and help those NGOs in all their diversity realize that they can be part of the solution. When their campaigning prowess, for example, is something we need more of in the economic system change movement. I'd be curious if there was any thoughts from the person who asked that question too, if they've got any ideas from their experience. Well, we can invite them up if it would be very interesting to know. Parmjit, are you around? Would you like to come and join us on stage? If so, we'd love it if you could turn your camera and microphone on.
Hi.
Oh, hi. Great. If you could just unmute, that would be brilliant.
Okay, hi. Really interesting talk. Thank you. Yeah, I just find that most people are not aware of the fundamental nature and the difference between extractive economies and non-extractive. And I feel that NGOs strategically are in a position where, that they can reach a lot of people. And, I feel that it's got to be a pressure that's coming from down below, from where I'm sitting. It's very difficult to break those structures and that mindset. Yeah. And even with our local councillors, which are people who are very bound to the old paradigm, and they don't kind of get that it's not right and, all the rest of it. So the pressure has to come from down below, because otherwise nothing's going to happen. So it's just like, and everyone's so busy, aren't they? It's like people who work in charities don't have the time of day.
Yeah. I think just listening to you speak, I entirely agree. It really makes me think it comes back to how democracy is enacted in our society, and how so many people feel their voice isn't being listened to, and the channels of influence are very narrow and steep gradient. So only a few are heard. And it reminds me of an organisation that we work with here in Scotland, in a town called Lynwood, which is just outside Glasgow. And it's a town that's had a hell of a difficult journey economically. They used to be dependent on a big car factory. They made Chryslers in the sort of post-war era. So thriving town.
Like Coventry, like where I'm from, Coventry, similar situation. And we're having so much difficulty getting councillors to agree to kick-start the economy so it's a greener version of what they used to do. And we've got all the resources here to do that.
Yeah, that's the thing. There's plenty of that story of Lynwood, which there's a paper on our website that you might be interested in, because it's such a heartening story. There was an attempt pretty pernicious, almost toxic attempt to impose an economic model on Lynwood. And there was some malpractice going on there too. So there's a bit of a mystery story as well. But this group of local women just said, no, we're not having this. That economic model is not for us. We won't be able to afford it. It's not the sort of economic activity we want in our community. And they have fought for well over 10 years to talk to the community around them. They've done loads of consultations, loads of listening exercises, and come up with a different vision for Lynwood. And then they're putting it in place through community wealth building, though they don't call it that, they just get onto it, through the foundational economy, through community ownership, through living wage businesses, pro-social businesses, and they don't use the theory that I write about. They've just rolled up their sleeves, these amazing local women, and delivering it. So yeah, they've put stories on our website talking about Lynwood as a microcosm, but it's a really, hearing you talk about the importance of grassroots art really reminded me of this amazing little story of Lynwood.
It's interesting, it's women.
Yeah. Well, interesting or perhaps unsurprising. Who knows?
Yeah.
Actually, the WEAll, the Wellbeing Economy Governments partnership, the 3 countries that founded that were all led by women. So Jacinda Ardern, Nicola Sturgeon, and Katherine Trebeck.
Absolutely.
Right? Yeah. Is there something in that? I mean, they've now got Mark Drakeford from Wales who's joined, and I wouldn't want it to become just a club of women leaders, because many other countries would like to be part of it. But there is something about that instinctive collaboration.
Something about minorities, and also it's interesting that Scotland have taken the idea on board, whereas England haven't, and Scotland have been taking advice from the people that have written the books on community wealth building. Yeah, and all the rest of it. So anyway, I've hogged it enough now. So thank you very much. Brilliant. Bye-bye.
A really important message if I think about bottom up and grassroots, and also some really interesting examples, because sometimes it's good to learn from what's been done and how change can actually happen. So thank you.
I mean, the story of Lynwood is just extraordinary. I mean, and they're not there yet. They've still got such a journey ahead of them, and it has been bumpy, and there have been tears and heartache, but they show us the hints of why definitely they show us why we need a different economic system. But in that one story, they also show us the outlines of what it could be about. So yeah, if anyone's interested, that it's written up on our website in a WEAll briefing paper.
Great. Definitely going to point everyone towards some resources on your website, because there's so many examples, and especially the matrix that you showed in your presentation. So many, if you have a question on how something can be implemented, there's an answer for it. So thank you. So another question, again from Adam, he's asking, why do you not think that austerity was, in some sense, counter pro-GDP if Keynes was correct that government spending increases consumption, which means increased growth? So.
Yeah, I mean, Adam, you're right. I mean, just this sort of distorted agenda and sort of undue deference to getting the debt down, and that mantra of the UK economy being akin to our household economy just took hold, and it was deliberately propagated as well. I mean, there was deliberate, probably even propaganda, I'd say. I mean, I remember when the government changed hands just after the global financial crisis, there was media leaks with reports coming out of civil service departments had gone on a spa retreat or something, and that was this tiny little example, I don't know, maybe cost a couple of £100 or something, that was used to denigrate all the state apparatus and this sort of paint this really toxic story of government. And it was all part of that agenda of, get the debt down and sort of try to, austerity wasn't understood that, things are like a balloon, you squeeze it here, it pops up elsewhere. I don't think the idea of failure demand was at all in the mind of the likes of political leaders at that time. But it was, severely misguided. But worse than that, it did so much damage to communities across the UK. And we're still seeing the legacy of that in so many different ways. I mean, I don't think it's a coincidence that this is the era in which food banks made a return. I mean, this is food banks. I mean, to all credit to people who are volunteering for them, but this is old-fashioned charity in the worst sense. I mean, we shouldn't be giving out food parcels. We should be ensuring people have decent enough wages to provide what they want to provide for, rather than being reliant on handouts. I mean, it's an extraordinary era that we've been in, even prior to COVID. I mean, all this stuff was prior to COVID, so it's just been intensified now.
It really is a case of learning from the past. But as you said, whilst it has happened pre-COVID, COVID has definitely revealed a lot of the trust statistics that have come out for food packages are awful. But you're right, we should have the systems in place for them that are not to be necessary. But thank you. So another question from Duncan, and he's asking, what are the main barriers to moving to a wellbeing economy?
Oh, Duncan, good question. I'd be curious actually what folks in the audience also think on this too, because you're all activists in one way or another, and you've faced and encountered your own barriers. So I'd be really curious what folks have experienced themselves. I think one of the biggest barriers is our narrow mindsets. I use this really horrific phrase about our narrow cognitive bandwidth. And essentially, this is this idea that we have been told there is no alternative. Growth is the only solution, but we might put a nice adjective in front of growth, such as sustainable or inclusive or shared or green growth. But, we are still boxed into this assumption that it has to be growth because we don't have the imaginations to think of an economy that's better than growth. I mean, back in 1983, Ronald Reagan said there are no limits to growth because there are no limits to our imagination. And I think now it is our limited imagination that is stopping us getting our heads around the necessity and the nature of an economy that's better than growth. So that's one. The other one I'd point to is the political capture, that confluence of wealth and power and the extent to which the rules of the game are quite literally designed and rigged by those who do very well out of the system. This is what Donella Meadows describes as a success to the successful. And that is toxic, hence why we need to really robust democratic mechanisms to overcome that. And I guess one other one, it's partly why WEAll was created, is that while there is no shortage of amazing organisations working in this space, they have been separate and not collaborative enough, and often funding streams exacerbate those challenges, and people have, want to focus on their own organisation, and it means that we've been splintering and not sort of linking arms in the way, metaphorically, that we need to do to really shift the system. And those who were responsible for bringing in the previous economic system, which some would describe as neoliberal, I don't, but that agenda, that came because they focused on what they agreed on rather than where they differed. And I think we're very good at diving into details and minute differences, and rather than recognising that ultimately we're all on the same side and we need to support and work together. So at WEAll, we have a mantra of togetherness above agreement, which is lovely to say, but it's really hard to do it in practice. But we're going to keep trying to be this sort of welcoming, inclusive space. And WEAll has folks who are extraordinarily radical and impatient in the extent of system change they want yesterday. And we've also got folks who are part of our membership who are working deep within the establishment organisations, and they all matter. They're all part of that conversation. We need all those voices and all those different perspectives and spheres of influence. So there are a couple of the barriers that I'd be really keen if anyone else has others they'd add to that list, because sadly there are several barriers when we're not short of things that we're up against.
Yeah, but seemingly there are ways to overcome them. The cooperation that your organisation is doing has an amazing effort to try and overcome that. And I remember you've mentioned Kate Rayworth earlier. I remember just talking about language and the mindset of growth is we see upwards and forwards as such positive things, and downwards and backwards as such. Changing that is going to be such a big thing because we read fiction or non-fiction, or we watch TV, and all of that kind of really indoctrinates our brains into thinking that growth is really good. So
and that's why Jeremy and I sort of ran with the idea of arrival and making yourselves at home, because for anyone who's traveled, and my family is the other side of the world from me, I know how beautiful that feeling can be. And the task of making yourself at home, where there's actually a lovely video, it comes from the US, of some guy, apparently some wrestler or rock star or something. It's an ad for a mortgage company of all places. But this guy, he walks into his house and he starts taking off his muscly arms, and he takes off his ripped chest. And basically his message is, home is where you can be yourself. Now, he's using that to peddle mortgages for a company, but the message, I think, is really true. Home is where we take off our shoes and wipe off our makeup and be ourselves. And it's also where we share better, where we look after each other, even if folk don't contribute in different ways. And I wouldn't want to romanticize home, because I know there's a lot of homes that are dangerous places. But in the best sense of the term, home can be a really beautiful place where everyone's looked after. And that's why the idea of arrival and making ourselves at home really resonated with Jeremy and I. But yeah, the stories we tell ourselves are so powerful. And the idea of growth, Holly, is nuts because it's such an abstract term. So if I said to you, Holly, move, you would, first question would be, well, which way? Up, down, fast, slow? What you'd want some quality around that. And with growth, we just say grow. We don't ask who for, what sort of growth, how's it being created. We don't stop and ask those questions nearly enough. We just have this blind blinkered assumption that growing is good.
No, definitely. And I think I'm going to encourage people to read your book. We're definitely going to share it on our platforms. I think it's got a brilliant message, but definitely a big barrier to that is our perception. So thank you. We've got time for a couple more questions. So one from David. He's saying, what are ways we can... I think he's talking about WEAll and perhaps there's this wider question of what can we do every day, or what does your organisation, what can we do to like participate, become involved?
So yeah,
and how do you groups and things? Yeah. So
in terms of getting involved, jump onto WEAll Citizens, and you're really welcome, and you'll be connected to a community and part of just connected to others who are wanting to go on the same journey and be part of the wider movement. So, for example, recently we had someone from the Philippines advising someone in New Zealand on their project, and they're just the sort of lovely, beautiful connections that WEAll Citizens is set up. And there's lots of events, and you can share all these events. I'm sure we've been promoting the festival on WEAll Citizens, so lots of ways to get involved and just feel part of something greater and something sort of that's wider than yourself, but also is there to support you. In terms of individual actions, I mean, I really think it speaks to our previous conversation. It's about having these conversations with your own sphere of influence, with your family, with your friends, with your colleagues, to call out lazy thinking, to say, oh, hang on a minute, is that really true? Look, the UK had a growing economy over the last few decades, or last few years even, but look at the quality of jobs. Just to sort of do that, hang on a minute, question in your own everyday conversations, to just try to open up different ways of thinking about the economy. I mean, the obvious things around getting involved politically, thinking about your line of work. If you've got, say, a pension or something, think about where that's invested. I mean, things like how we consume. I've got the Fairphone. Think, how do we move away from infrastructure that boxes us in through planned obsolescence, that something like the Fairphone was deliberately designed to try and get around. So there's lots of choices, but I don't want to overstate the responsibility being on the shoulder of individuals. This is a structural thing, hence why we need to mobilize as a movement rather than put all the pressure on individuals to change their own ways, because I think that's important, because it signals demand and it helps you feel efficacy and it helps you feel part of something. But I think the onus of responsibility is in our politics and in our distribution and in our economic system, not on individuals, though that important though that is. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. So really the importance of cooperation and seeing like being part of a larger group. Yeah. So Mary's got a question, and I think we'll bring her up. If Mary, if you'd like to join, I will invite you. If not, if you're able to turn your camera on and your microphone if you're there.
This is one of the things I've been really missing, is not seeing people's faces in these conversations. So hi, Mary.
It is. Hi, Mary. If you'd like to share your question. Oh, we can't actually hear you, I don't think. Sorry.
Is that better?
Yeah,
that's perfect.
Yeah, the trouble is that there's all sorts of things going on that people scarcely understand. The privatization, I hardly understand it myself, but things like asset stripping, share buybacks, offshore tax havens, and with they privatize the water companies. They strip all the assets off, give the profits to their shareholders, and guess what? The water companies are going bust and can't even clean up the sewers, blah, blah, blah. And that requires legislation to actually identify what the scams are and stop them doing it. And they've been ignoring all that and then just going for austerity. And you know, the party that might have been prepared to do something about it, not all of it, you know, but they're prepared to do something about it. They invented all this stuff about anti-Semitism in order to bring them down, and you know, all the stuff that went on in the Red Wall, you know, telling people, I don't know, the Cummings effect. But this is, you know, this is a barrier to progress.
Yeah. And I think a lot of this has been painted as probably more obtuse and complicated though it is, to sort of create a barrier for people getting involved. I guess my recommendation to folks generally would be, don't feel you need to be an expert in absolutely everything, because that will be exhausting and you'll be constantly feeling that you're failing. There are folks who are diving deep on all these different corners of these issues, so support them. But then find the area that you're most excited about and you're most passionate about, and dive deep there. And that crucially, don't dive so deep that you keep your eyes narrow. Dive deep, but see the connections and the dots. Yeah.
But you know, you've got this wonderful talent. You know, people that wonderful thing they're doing is this redistribution, the food banks and everything. As you say, get the basics right, and so this is what and I'm doing. You know, I'm doing community projects. I'm supporting local exchange trading schemes and you know, things like that, where people share resources amongst each other. But you know, on the political side, it just looks really too much.
But I mean, don't underestimate the significance of that work, because that is demonstrating the feasibility and the desirability of a different way of doing things. It proves to policymakers that this change is not a step into the unknown. So that work that you feel you're doing in small scale is of enormous significance, above and beyond the impact it's having locally, because it's, to use that really geeky term, it's prefiguring the sort of change we need to see. So Mary, I think you're clearly doing an amazing job, and don't be too hard on yourself. If you're active and working with others and seeing the bigger picture, you don't need to have your mind across everything. You've clearly got a niche that you're running with. So that's awesome.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary. If you wouldn't mind turning off your camera and microphone, thank you. And we do have more questions, but I'm afraid we're running a bit out of time. So I think that's actually a really lovely ending note, in the sense that we do have a lot of hope for the future, that the Wellbeing Economy agenda does give us that, and that there are ways that we can organise. And thank you so much, because I think that was a really inspiring talk.
Pleasure. Really lovely to meet you, Holly, and thank you for having me. Thank everyone who joined.
Thank you so much. So for everyone who's around, I know that the chat's been going on, there's been a lot of conversation and people still have questions. So if you want to stick around and talk, please do. But thank you very much for attending this session. And I hope you will have a great rest of your day. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Holly.